Welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today we're talking with Thomas Jefferson, as interpreted by Bill Barker, about Thomas Jefferson's teachers. Leave your questions in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Oh, well, what a pleasure. Good afternoon, my friends, and welcome here to, part of my library, writing room, cabinet, an area of Monticello where not too many people have had the opportunity to come visiting because I want to lock this off during a majority of the early part of the day, that I might be alone and attend to my, to my correspondence and to my administrations, and even now, as I endeavor to commonplace. I still commonplace, which is essentially something I learned in my youth, taught in my earliest classroom. When I reading something that delights me, that is wont to provoke me in thought, then I copy it. I commonplace it in a book so that I might have that particular quote ever with me to refer to, so I might not have to seek out the book in my library otherwise. Do you know, I was taught as you begin to commonplace that as you continue through your life, you suddenly then acquire an idea of your particular like in phraseology, your particular style of writing. Many have said that I've enjoyed the works of Henry Fielding, so my writing is somewhat Fieldian, and you become aware of this as you keep a commonplace book. Now, you may wonder, why might I be referring to this particular proclivity on this day? It is because I have heard that you all are referring to this week as Teacher Appreciation Week. I could think of nothing more desirable than to set aside a week, if not a whole month and a year, in appreciation of our teachers. Do you know, I've always said the two most noble vocations of man: firstly, the cultivation of the soil; secondly, the cultivation of the mind, and you may turn that vice versa if you choose. I've always been devoted to instruction and learning, open and free inquiry, Socratic investigation. So I'm thinking perhaps today an important subject for us to pursue would be our teachers, that I might reflect on my teachers who have ever remained most in our life. So let this be the subject, and let us commence a pursuit of teachers and their great value in sustaining the founding principles of our nation. Because you know, as I have written, that nation which expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization expects what never was and never shall be. Our teachers are a noble coterie of influence for our nation. Your first question.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, it is well known that you've been a lifelong proponent for universal education. Why do you feel it's so necessary?
Well, I think you just heard the reason why, because it's necessary for the sustaining of our founding principles, to have a better understanding of the fact that we are the first nation in the history of man founded upon principles and ideas. I'm not the first to say that. We've not been founded upon monarchy and royalty, nobility, aristocracy. It is education that helps us realize and never forget that's why we fought the war. That's why we shed our blood, to begin a new world order devoted to the inherent right of self-government, the inherent right of equal and exact justice for every individual. It is education that helps us to understand this, that helps us to stand solidly upon the facts and to never suffer thereby someone pulling the wool of ignorance over our eyes to a mistrust of our own vision.
Well, can you now tell us a little bit about your experience in your own education? Maybe do you remember your first teachers?
I do. I can never forget them. I hope you all remember your teachers from your youth, and do not forget what they helped you to better understand, realizing we're a curious creature and how are we going to know unless we ask. So that commenced for me at a very, very early age. In fact, do you know, I remember I must have been about 2 years of age. being placed on a velvet cushion and handed up to an individual on horseback as my father and our family made our way from Shadwell, where I was born and grew up, to Tuckahoe Plantation in Goochland. That was my mother's cousin plantation, the Randolph Plantation. And it was there at Tuckahoe that I had my first teacher that I can remember. And by the way, when you think that most of us in our earliest cognizances, that is, the very first thing that we might remember in our youth occurs when you are 2, well, I was 5 when I commenced education at Tuckahoe. It was a gentleman by the name of Staples, John Staples. Now, many have said, well, what about the Reverend William Douglas? Oh, yes, he was an influence as well, but a little later, after we returned to Shadwell. But John Staples was a friend of my father. He was a surveyor as well. And there is a slight communication between Mr. Staples and me throughout my entire life, though earlier on. So I began instruction with him. Early on, perhaps, well, an English school, as it would be called, reading, writing, common arithmetic, and some ancient history and modern history. Many people have forgotten about John Staples there, hired by the Randolph family at Tuckahoe, and I say hired because, remember, my father was invited by the estate of William Randolph, my mother's cousin, who had passed away. And so, as you know, here in the wilderness, thank heaven for those who come to the aid of the orphans and widows. My father was called as an executor to preside over the instruction of the Randolph children as well as his own children. So it was the Randolph estate that provided the monies early on for John Staples. And then when we returned to Shadwell, my teacher at Shadwell was a Latin teacher because I was attending a Latin academy. And his name was Reverend Dr. William Douglas. Oh, he was a Scot. He had a strong burr in his accent. And as I have remarked, he was somewhat of a superficial Latinist. So I began the pronunciation of many a Latin word, well, mispronouncing, if you will regard. And then, fortunately, I was able to leave the instruction of Reverend Douglas and attend to the instruction of the Reverend James Maury. I can hardly forget Maury. My heavens, what a delight. He was a good friend, and his family has remained good friends of mine throughout the successive generations. Maury, by the way, ran a classical academy, and that academy was on the land of Dr. Thomas Walker, the esteemed surveyor, known as Castle Hill. There was a building right there where the boys would gather for their instruction, and so that you would not have to keep riding back and forth from our various plantations and farms to Castle Hill, we quartered there. We all slept up in the garret. Some tell me that building is still standing, which I'm delighted to think. And imagine if those walls could talk. The young students that were there, Dr. Walker's son, John Walker, Colonel John Walker, Dabney Carr, my very good friend, was there, Matthew Maury, the Reverend James Maury's son, attended there too. We were happy, a group of various curious young students, young boys, with a thirst for knowledge.
Well, it sounds like your thirst of knowledge continued beyond that, and you were able to attend the College of William and Mary. What experience was that like, and how did it influence your ideas on things like education?
Well, thank you for mentioning William and Mary. I was most fortunate indeed to be able to attend the old Royal College. I say that because nonetheless I was fortunate to be able to attend the English school and then the Latin school and then, of course, Maury's Classical Academy, and to continue to William and Mary was an extra delight and privilege, all because my father left monies in his estate that I could attend to this. As I mentioned, it was father who removed the family from Shadwell to Tuckahoe. But lamentably, when he was only 49 years old, 1757, I was still at Morris Academy. My father passed away quite suddenly. He left my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. I was the eldest son. I hardly understood the weight of responsibility upon my shoulders at that time, the weight of the British laws of primogeniture, first genitor family, the eldest son, to inherit directly all of his father's freeholdings. Yes, my father was a freeholder. A British term, legally, he owned outright all of the land. At the time, 5 farms, 3,500 acres, and I think you know, no different throughout all of our sister colonies at the time, he owned outright the majority of families living upon that land. I was only 14 years old. How privileged indeed that Father left monies that I could continue my education, and therefore within about 2 years, I wrote to my father's executors, thank heaven, my father's friends who came to the aid of the orphans and the widows upon my father's death. Colonel George Harvey, and as well Colonel Gilmer, William Gilmer, and Dr. Walker himself, all provided me that aid of my father's estate to go to Williamsburg and attend the old Royal College. I had to write for the opportunity. I could not simply say I would be desirous to go to William and Mary. I had to write for the reasons why I felt I needed to go to William and Mary. And that is the truth, to need to go to William and Mary. Certainly to support my further administration, if you will, not in government, but of my father's estate, of all of the plantations that I inherited, the maintenance of all residing upon that land. I felt that if I remained back at Shadwell Farm, well, then I would simply lose out without the opportunity of enlightening myself and further education. And so I wrote to the executors of Father's estate, and they provided the monies. I'll never forget riding into Williamsburg that winter of 1759, 1760. I was not even 17 years of age, to begin my studies at the Old Royal College of William and Mary, the highest curriculum there of the 4 schools. Of course, the 4 schools began with the seminary. Remember, William and Mary was a seminary of the Church of England. And then there was the grammar school. I had already attended to the grammar school under Mr. Staples and the Reverend Douglas, let alone Reverend Maury. And then, of course, the Indian school for the education of the eldest sons in the Mattaponi, Pamunkey, Chickahominy tribes. And then the School of Mathematics and Natural Philosophy. And that was presided over by the Reverend William Small. Reverend Dr. William Small, I can never forget him.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Dr. Small, and did you continue speaking with him after he left William and Mary?
Indeed, I continued to correspond with him. You're right. He returned to England shortly after I left the Old Royal College. The Reverend Dr. William Small became my constant friend. It was my great and good fortune to fall under his tutelage there for 2 years. As I mentioned, he held the chair of mathematics and natural philosophy. He introduced me to the great system of things throughout the universe. He had gentlemanly, correct manners. How necessary in a teacher to have good manners, to be an example unto his students of respect. We certainly had great respect for Dr. Small. By a very simple formula, it was quite obvious Dr. Small had a great respect for us. He realized each and every one of us was a new mind, never seen before upon this globe, ready to be provoked in the intellect, inspired in the imagination. Secondly, he had an enlarged and a liberal mind. That is not a political term, liberal, referring to the Latin word libertas, meaning free, cultivating an open and free mind, open to everything throughout your entire life. How do you enter in tomorrow without an open mind? And he had a happy talent for communication, exactly as I have written it, making education happy, enjoyable, a constant pursuit, lifelong. When is an individual ever completed their education? No, I think, and I have written perhaps more than any other, Dr. Small fixed the destinies of my life, taught me the value of time, taught me, as the Romans said, tempus fugit, time flies, so therefore, as the Romans said, carpe diem, seize the day. How valuable that is for each and every one of us when we think of the very short time that we are on this globe. I have Reverend Dr. William Small to thank for that recognition and constant study.
You would next study law with George Wythe in Williamsburg, and Morgan is curious to know more about George Wythe and your relationship with him.
Well, thank you, Morgan. I can tell you it was a great delight, particularly to fall under the tutelage of Mr. George Wythe after Dr. Small left Virginia. I mentioned earlier that he left Virginia. It was 1764. He went back to England to live in Birmingham. And coincidentally, Morgan, Dr. Wythe became a member of the Lunar Society. Talk about a knowledge of the system of things, a coterie of gentlemen that met at Matthew Bolton's house in Birmingham, known as Soho House. And there in their coterie, of course, was Matthew Bolton himself, along in the company of Josiah Wedgwood and Rasmus Darwin and Dr. James Watt, Dr. Joseph Priestley, and for a time even Dr. Benjamin Franklin attended there. In fact, Dr. Franklin and Dr. Watt became good friends in pursuing the observation of steam. And so I kept in correspondence with Dr. Small after he left and went to England, and even wrote him on what at the time we did not realize, but what at the time was the dawn of what became the American Revolution, that spring of 1775. I wrote him about the attack up at Lexington and Concord, and 2 weeks later at Williamsburg. Do you know, I never discovered until many years later, when I visited Birmingham, that Dr. Small had passed away that very spring. But as you ask me of Mr. George Wythe, they were friends. Absolutely. That's why I've reflected a bit on Dr. Small, because it was in the company of Dr. Small and Mr. George Wythe that I was invited, the three of us, to the governor's palace there in Williamsburg, and that was under the administration of Governor Fauquier, Francis Fauquier. His grandfather was born and grew up in France, though the family moved to England. And I have always believed that Governor Fauquier was perhaps one of the finest of administrators in colonial Virginia. We called ourselves, that is the company of Governor Fauquier, Mr. George Wythe, Dr. William Small and myself, a party quarre, a party of four. We would enjoy musicales and elegant repasts and the most delightful and open conversation, good common sense, the likes of which I doubt I've ever heard since. George Wythe was an attorney, well and deeply read in the law. And so it was, after I left the tutelage of Dr. Small, I began reading law with Mr. George Wythe. He became my constant friend as well. He helped me to understand the foundations of English common law, particularly how it is vested in the old Justinian code of law from the 6th century, the foundation of Western law, put into its effect by Roman Emperor Justinian I. He helped me to understand how common law continues to grow and evolve with every successive generation. You might think otherwise. We'd go back to the ages of the darkest ignorance to find the greatest enlightenment, or that nothing could be improved upon in the present, let alone in the future. That is the marvel of law, to understand, as Mr. Wythe certainly brought to my mind, the earth will always belong to the living generation. The dead hold no power over us. They're gone. And, well, that's common sense. No one has ever lived in the past. After all, a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. And so it was Mr. Wythe who opened my mind in this pursuit of the law, who led me into the practice of the law after 3 years. He only took a student for a period of 3 years. And so it was, as I was licensed then, in the spring of 1766. I went into the practice the next year, 1767, and practiced for 7 years entirely, until 1774, when, as you know, the monarchy closed down the courts of justice in Virginia. Since that time, I never went back to the public practicing of the law. I became a bit weary of argumentation over the letter of the law, but rest assured, more devoted in the pursuit of where the laws are made in the legislative venue. Now, as I rattle on, I think you may already know Mr. Wythe went to Philadelphia, was seated in the Continental Congresses there. He was there in the spring of 1776 when we declared our independence, and he signed our Declaration of American Independence. Coincidentally, as a commentary upon those who read law with Mr. Wythe, let alone myself, another of his students was our Chief Justice, John Marshall. Young Marshall read law with Mr. Wythe for a period of 3 years. Can you imagine two individuals more different in their opinion of the law, having read the law under the very same teacher? But therefore, is further testament of the integrity of George Wythe to teach the foundation of the law and to recognize every generation has a right to argue and to debate that law. No, Mr. Wythe, a good friend, passed away. Well, it's going on now in this year of 24, let me see, about 18 years ago. He passed away. I shall never forget him. My good friend and my mentor.
Well, you talk about the importance of improving with each successive generation, and you were eventually elected second governor of Virginia, where you would make some big changes to the College of William and Mary, specifically abolishing the School of Divinity. Why did you feel that was necessary?
Well, yes, you are absolutely correct. That was one of my very first concerns in trying to improve the curriculum at the Old Royal College of William and Mary. Well, very simply, as we severed our ties with the monarchy of England, we severed our ties with the Church of England. Remember that. In the majority of our colonies before the war, we were governed by the Church of England. Two exceptions, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. But here in Virginia, we had to pay a tax to the support of the Church of England. If we wanted to marry, we had to purchase a marriage license from the Church of England. We were required by the alliance of the ecclesiastical laws of the Church of England with the civil authority to attend the Church of England at least 12 Sundays a year, on the average 1 Sunday a month. And if you failed to pay your taxes, if you failed to attend to church, you were fined. And if you failed to pay your fine, you were thrown into jail. And so all of this, if you will, reminds us that as we attended to William and Mary as the Royal College, well, an initial purpose of it was to act as a seminary of the Church of England. Now, the young boys might attend for, well, they did. I think there was 7 years they could receive their Arts Magister, or what is referred to as a master. But in order to be ordained, they had to sail to England. And then they would be ordained in England and would return not only to take up their sees and their parishes, but also to hire themselves out as teachers. As you heard me say earlier, the Reverend Dr. William Douglas was a teacher, Church of England. Though he was a Scot, he took his oath of allegiance to the Church of England. The Reverend James Murray, as well, of the Church of England. And so there you have it. And Dr. William Small, he was a Scot, and he had to take his oath of allegiance to the Church of England in order to teach at the Old Royal College of William and Mary. So this is the reason, fact and simple, that when I became the second elected governor of Virginia, when I sat on a committee to revise the monarchical code of laws under which we were born and grew up, I set about in revising the curriculum at William and Mary to first dissolve the School of Divinity. And then in its stead, well, we had, as I initiated, a School of Modern Languages, a School of Literature, a School of Medicine, and lest we forget, a School of Law. The first School of Law in our new nation. And whom do you think I appointed the first Master of Law? Correct. George Wythe, under whom I had read law, and so many others, to be guaranteed a firm grasp and foundation in law, and to continue to argue and debate as laws will continue to evolve.
During this time, you'd also serve on a committee to revise the laws of Virginia. At this time, did you suggest that there be a general educational system in Virginia?
I certainly did. That was bill numbered 79. In fact, in this book that I've just been reading here, they have been so kind as to print, if you will, my bill for the general diffusion of knowledge of the 126 revisals of that monarchical code. I hope you're familiar with bill numbered 82. And that's the bill for religious freedom. I hope ever to be remembered for that. The first law of its kind, in essence, not only to protect an individual's opinion in religion, but to protect the freedom of one's own mind, in recognition that our Creator has created our minds free, and free He desires it to remain. Bill 21, as I had referred to primogeniture, which benefited me as the eldest son of my father's family to inherit directly all of his property when I was such a young boy, only 14. Do you know Bill 21 dissolved primogeniture within 1 year? We nipped aristocracy right in the bud. So, to the point, bill numbered 79, for the general diffusion of knowledge, for the building of schoolhouses all throughout Virginia, providing an elementary curriculum unto the poor as well as the wealthy, unto the female as well as the male, district schools to follow the elementary, and then finally, a true University of Virginia. I had initially wanted William and Mary to be that first university. Oh, there were many who thought that perhaps Dr. Franklin's College in Philadelphia might become the first, or if you remember, 79, North Carolina, to have their university commence. But here, if you will, is the first paragraph, which I think explains it all. The first paragraph of my bill for the general diffusion of knowledge, and why education is so necessary. To wit, if you would allow me. Whereas it appeareth that however certain forms of government are better calculated than others to protect individuals in the free exercise of their natural rights, and are at the same time themselves better guarded against degeneracy, yet experience hath shown that even under the best forms, those entrusted with power have in time and by slow operations perverted it into tyranny. And it is believed that the most effectual means of preventing this would be to illuminate, as far as practicable, the minds of the people at large, and more especially to give them knowledge of those facts which history exhibiteth, that possessed thereby of the experience of other ages and countries, they may be enabled to know ambition under all of its shapes, and prompt to exert their natural powers to defeat its purposes. What more could I say? That laws are formed as virtuous and as applicable to protecting and defending the inherent rights of an individual, particularly to self-government and equal exact justice, that laws are furnished in that direction as the people themselves have been well educated.
Well, now I'm really curious. How did this early effort to establish a public system of education turn out? Has it been successful?
Argumentative. It turned out argumentative, as if my bill for religious freedom was not argumentative enough in itself. That finally passed after 7 years, though I was not here. I was in France at that time. But my good friend Mr. Madison helped to usher it through the Virginia House of Delegates, January 1786. The general diffusion of knowledge continued to be argued and debated, It essentially failed initially. However, in time, again, Mr. Madison came to the forefront and did help to an extent for a system of schoolhouses. Now, not extensively, to an extent. I think I'm going to live my entire life and not see a one-room schoolhouse here in Charlottesville. If you're asking me what is the essence of the contention, Well, those who continue to refer to me as a red-breeched radical revolutionary seeking to force them to take their hard-earned monies out of their pockets to pay for the education of their neighbor who can ill afford it. Well, citizens, I beg your pardon. Your neighbor is your fellow citizen. We are all Americans in this effort. As I say, the future integrity, safety, and defense of our nation is through education. That's the only way. Enlighten the people generally, and superstitions of body and mind will take flight like evil spirits at the dawn of day. That's education. Education establishes facts. Education dispels superstition. Education is power. Education is safety. Education is happiness. So therefore, as I have said and written and will continue to say and write, the money you will spend for education will never be more than the 1,000th part of what you will spend unto future monarchs, princes, priests, and noblemen who will rise up amongst us if we leave ourselves in ignorance.
Now, we know the University of Virginia is getting its start, and we have some people that are very curious. How did you end up selecting professors for the university?
From hearsay, I don't mean to make that seem somewhat flippant, but yes, those with recommendation who have been in their chairs at most ancient and most virtuous European universities, at the forefront of the realms of knowledge. That is how we sought to welcome, invite, you may say entice, these teachers to take the risk of sailing the ocean westward, and yet that they might realize here in a new world, in a forest primeval, that they would have an opportunity that might not be theirs, teaching back in the universities which have ever been prone to tumults and calumnies through centuries and millennium, that here in a new world, that they might have the opportunity to provoke and inspire young minds to improve the condition of man without that lengthy history that had preceded in violence and turmoil. So this is something that we sought out to do as we are now, this year of 24, inviting those to come here and to fulfill instruction in our university. I thought by now, this year, 1824, the doors would be open, but lamentably, our rotunda is not yet completed. So it does appear, perhaps next year in 25, that our university will open and that we will then be of effect, not only through our Commonwealth, but I'm hopeful throughout our country and throughout the world.
Now, while you're here at Monticello, you're surrounded by family, and we also have a question from Chester, who's curious about the education of your grandchildren, specifically your granddaughters.
Chester, I am delighted to say that no one could be of more influence in the education of my grandchildren than my daughter, Mrs. Randolph, Martha Jefferson Randolph. She, I'm happy to say, did have the good fortune of an education. While my late wife was still living, she herself, well educated, was of that provision to our children. As you may know, only 2 of our children survived infancy, Martha and her sister Polly, or Mary Jefferson. And so therefore they were both influenced by that education in their youth to pursue that for their own families. Now, lamentably, Polly passed away when she was only 24 years old, 1804. And ultimately, only one of her children, my grandson, young Epps, Frank Epps, has survived. But I'm telling you now that Frank Epps has a devotion to education, wishes to attend our university. I have gifted him with Poplar Forest, my retreat house. I believe perhaps I took my last journey there last year, 18 and 23, so I'm looking forward to him taking up administration there. Though, do you know, he says he might be more interested to go to the Floridas and commence a pineapple plantation, but that he might also seek to commence a university in the Floridas, a Florida state, if you will, to that effort. Now, as far as some of my select grandchildren that I think are most interested in education, Cornelia, I think, is delighted in education. Mary, to an extent. My granddaughter-in-law, Jane Hollins Nicholas, the wife of my grandson Thomas Jefferson Randolph, or Jeff as we call him. Jane is very interested in education. So it could well be that though they reside at Tufton Farm at present, that as of course Edge Hill on just on the east side of Monticello is the old Randolph holdings out in this neighborhood, that they would remove themselves to Edge Hill and begin a young ladies' academy. Do you know, Mrs. Jefferson, I could not help but think when I heard this initially, would be the happiest to see this commence. And I myself am delighted that it may transpire. Whether I'll be living or not, I cannot say. But perhaps someday, if it does begin, it may become one of the finest finishing schools for young ladies in our nation.
Now, was there any education for Monticello's enslaved community? Who were some of their teachers?
My family as best they can. Would that we could provide such a system of education for our families, all our families here. But lamentably, it has not been the custom at present, with such concern and a near fear of what could happen with an educated enslaved family. I wonder whether it would ever take hold. I never deny any of our families here to take a book out of my library to learn to read or write. I can tell you Mary, my granddaughter that I referred to earlier, is of great interest to instruct. There are those who happily can read, let alone write. Peter Fawcett, of course, Robert Hemings, and James Hemings, his brother. I cannot help but be reminded when I was growing up, Jupiter Evans, dear Jupiter, who accompanied me back and forth from Williamsburg, Virginia, who stayed with me in the garret there at the old Royal College, himself had the enlightenment of my privilege in education. And he knew, as I did, a time in our former colonies where the Bray schools were conducted in many of our urban markets. These were created by Colonel Thomas Bray, an Englishman who helped to form the Foundling Hospital near London. These were schools built in Boston and New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis, and Williamsburg, Virginia, dedicated to the education of young enslaved children, that they might have the benefit of learning to read and write. And yet, lamentably, with the war, all of that disappeared. I understand that there's an effort to reclaim the old Bray School in Williamsburg. Would that could be an influence to reclaim that effort to provide universal education to all of us, not only those who have the privilege now under the present laws, but there it is it not? That virtue of education, that new laws may be created to make the old laws obsolete. And I mean by that amendments to our Constitution. I know only 12. I can tell you what I hope will be the 13th. And they're a new dawn of enlightenment to pursue the inalienable right of every individual to what I believe is the inherent right of education. So I lament to say, no, there is no school here conducted at Monticello or my other farms in which the enslaved have the opportunity collectively to attend to an education.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, it seems that we have one more question for you. And we're really curious to hear if you have any hopes for the future of the University of Virginia during its construction or for education in the United States.
My hope for our university is the hope for our nation. University in its curriculum represents an open and free, continually evolving curriculum. It is different in that context from a collegiate curriculum. And therefore, as we discover new frontiers of knowledge, as we continue to pursue science, and you know, I will follow science wherever it should lead us, we will then be able to introduce new courses that are instructed by those whom themselves have pursued this as their lifelong interest and eventual legacy. That this may be for our university and for our nation concurrently and consecutively, to lift us, if you will, towards further improvement of the condition of man. So yes, I have great hope for our university. I look forward to its doors opening next year, and I look forward to universal systems of education, not only through our Commonwealth, but through our nation, so that we ourselves may be a beacon light to the rest of the world as we show the rest of the world that we are the best examples of those founding principles on behalf of the family of man. To preserve, protect, and defend those principles, ignorance is not bliss. My pleasure, and teachers, all honor to you and your noble vocation of enlightening and provoking the mind of man, to follow truth wherever it should lead us, and to be so bold as to question everything.